You're listening to Part 5 of The Wintermaker, read by author Jason Lee Willis. Chapter 17, Oshiman, Mizhike Band of Ojibwe Reservation, June 26, 1961. Megisi Asabakashi wept after Wally Crane left his front porch. Not a single tear had been shed while the oil delivery drivers smoked with him as they faced the evening sun. Megisi sifted the news, holding in his heart and mind without emotional reaction. He would pray before acting or speaking, and then he would give Wally his opinion on matters. Megisi wept in relief. Wally delivered an update from the hospital about Lily. While losing her hair in the fire, her flesh was remarkably unharmed, but her lungs remained a grave concern and kept her on oxygen for the near future. Lewis is looking at a nursing home up at Leech Lake once she's released from the hospital, Wally had explained. Given Lily's age, the recovery is going to take quite a while. I can drive you to Brainerd if you'd like. Megisi had shaken off the idea. The Takpai will know she's gone, and the Wintermaker will certainly sense it. I must stay here to make sure the horned serpent does not rise. He wept for his lost youth. Now in his 70s, Megisi was older than his own grandfather Nanak had been the year the Wintermaker rose from the depths of Lake Manitou. Megisi's fingers were crooked and tremulous, his back bent with time, and his left eye twitched, leaving his vision uncertain from hour to hour. Lily had also become something ancient and weak. It didn't help that his mind still painted a perfect picture of him and two playing along the shores of Blue Knife River as children. It was a time before boarding schools changed them both, a time before they faced the ancient evil that slumbered in the water near their home. As a boy, he'd believed he'd stare into the eyes of the horned serpent and thrust a fatal blow to any darkness that stood before him. Now he struggled to defecate in the morning. He wept in anger. The murders of his mother and grandfather still festered in his heart, and he now blamed the Takpai more than he blamed Adam Thunderface for the heinous deed. The Takpai didn't care about race, age, or religion. The 4 victims at Carousel Park provided the same sustenance that his family had provided 6 decades ago, and just as grandfather Nanak had been the first of many, the deaths in the roller coaster accident would only give the Takpai strength to create more accidents. The timing was too perfect. Death within days of the summer solstice, at exactly the spot where two had defeated the Takpai previously. He angrily wiped his tears from his wrinkled face, chewed on his bottom lip, and wished he could cover his hands in the blood of the man responsible for the accidents. Megisi left the porch to cook a simple supper upon the cast-iron stove in the center of his cabin. Unlike his grandfather, who filled his ceiling and walls with the relics needed as the keeper of the Ouijigan, Megisi's cabin was plainly lined with cedar from his bed to his cupboards that kept his own secrets covertly filed away. In the cedar-framed portraits, the faces of the past stared at him. He wept in remorse. His pride broke the family apart in a time they needed to band together, at the return of the Serpent Star. For a decade, the Asante Lodge had prepared itself for the return of the Serpent Star and the arrival of the Wishui, the one destined to defeat the evil in the depths of Lake Manitou. Jean Guerin had led the preparation. Megisi, Fawn Chevril, Bjorn Forsberg, Kermit Crane, Martin Nielsen, Farrell Looning, Albert Fisher, and Lily. Men like Superintendent White Wolf, Blackfish Labiche, and Pierre Leduc served roles to protect the ritual. A decade of interpreting prophecy and studying myth, text, and legend left the former Jesuit priest with confidence that the Creator, regardless of name, guided them to a righteous confrontation with a force of darkness. The team was complete, its members were strong, and they had been unified in purpose. Halley's Comet, the scientists declared, would arrive in May of 1910, The Serpent Star, Garen explained, would usher in the next era of the seven fires. Just like a solstice gave strength to the spiritual world, the comet would bring with it the power to defeat the horned serpent. Armed with the Wintermaker's own weapon, Garen believed the Wintermaker would be vulnerable enough to be destroyed by the Great Thunderbird. And I was supposed to be the Great Thunderbird incarnate. Despite his confidence, the Asante Lodge's leader fretted about little details. A week before the comet came closest to Earth, Gene Garen decided a return trip to Mankato was in order, so he hopped in his car and drove the 200 miles from the Blue Knife River to the Blue Earth River. "Why do you run off to confirm what we already know?" Superintendent White Wolf asked what they all wanted to ask Garen. "We know the Philosopher's Stone was found at Mankato and brought here to Lake Manitou." "If anything is missing, my trip to Mankato will confirm it. The last time I went in winter, and I was rushed. This time, I'll make sure. It's only a day's drive." Gene Garen returned in a coffin. Instead of fighting the Wintermaker with the water drum, the Asante Lodge buried its leader next to Nana Conan, Winnie, and Big Squeak Weber. The Blue Earth County Sheriff's Department informed them that Garen had been fueling his car at a gas station in Lahilier, Minnesota, when a near collision at the nearby intersection sent a car crashing into the pumps, where Gene was crushed into his own vehicle. In bitterness and despair, Fawn challenged the plan to confront the Wintermaker. Instead of being allowed to mourn, Lily vented her rage at her cousin. In that moment, instead of bringing healing to the family, McGeesy repeated the words of Nanak, that they were only witnessing the end of the fifth fire and the lighting of the sixth fire, that it would be at the end of the seventh fire that the Wintermaker would be vulnerable. This drove away both Lily and Fawn. For Lily, she could not get over the loss of her husband, especially with her only child, Louis, being so young. "It was a trick," Lily muttered. "It was all a lie." For Fawn, wounds created in 1898 suddenly reopened, and when she pressed Lily about her encounter with the Wintermaker, the conversation turned into a violent fight between the two. Fawn left with Blackfish Labiche for the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Reservation in North Dakota, before later vanishing into the Canadian Rockies. McGeesy suspected the reason they fought, which is why, even though he studied to become a Mide, he lived like a Catholic priest, siring no children. As evening passed to night, McGeesy burst out of his cabin to face Lake Manitou. There, on the high bluff overlooking the lake, he could see the shadow of Deadwood Island, now called Carousel Island. He wept with fear. As a child, he pictured himself stabbing the horned serpent as if it was a sturgeon or a flathead catfish swimming in the channel. Then Ouijigan priest Joseph Littletoad offered him as a living sacrifice, an omadai, to the Wintermaker. His soul was pulled out from his body and held by the deathly hands of his nemesis. If not for his sister, McGeesy's soul would have remained in the depths until his body withered and died. Now, having seen the real Wintermaker, he knew Father Garen was most likely right. The Wintermaker was an ancient evil with roots in the mythologies of all nations. Not only did it have ties to the past, but it also had connections to the apocalyptic prophecies of the future. McGeesy put his hands upon his knees and let out a groan from deep in his soul. He wept now with anticipation. He knew the Takpai had been woken by the blood of the 4 slain teens. Had Lily been safe at her watch post on the shores near Canaranzi Creek, the foul spirits would have been quickly put back to rest. Instead, she'd ironically been defeated by flames, heat, and smoke. The house fire caught her by surprise, but even if she'd sung the ancient words, McGeesy doubted if she could have protected herself from a burning building. Now, the embryos of evil would grow stronger by the day. The servants of the Wintermaker had one purpose: to protect and serve their master. If it was his will to rise, the Takpai would make it happen. If the Wintermaker needed protection, they would provide it. Both possibilities meant one thing: more deaths. A fight was coming, and the Asante Lodge was either absent, wounded, too old, or too young to muster a proper defense. Finally, he wept for those who would face the seventh fire. Chapter 18, A Pledge of Allegiance. Haggard Quarry, June 27, 1961. Biff Forsberg couldn't help but smile as he pressed the starter button on the yellow 1961 Caterpillar 922B. The big engine had so much power that the hairs on his forearms could feel the vibration. The beast wasn't much bigger than a normal tractor, yet it had twice as much metal and twice as much power. Red Dobie took his arm and pointed, shouting over the motor. "You need to turn the switch to disengage the starter motor once it's running. Hop up and give it some gas." Biff climbed up into the cab, filling the quarry with the sound of his new engine. Uncle Ewan stood next to his truck, arms crossed. Dobie stepped back to stand beside Ewan, and the two exchanged a few words. Biff lifted and lowered the bucket just to confirm the instruction he'd been given. "Can I get to work?" Uncle Ewan nodded. "Just don't run into anything." Biff put the loader into gear, lifted the bucket an inch off the ground, and took aim at the closest bit of rubble as Uncle Ewan drove back up to the office, and Dobie went back into the machine shed. At lunch, instead of reading his Norse mythology book given to him by his Uncle Ewan, Biff's curiosity drove him to hang out inside the shipping building with Dobie. "If it isn't the Dragon Rider, how's that yellow bitch ride?" Dobie asked without even glancing up. Biff shrugged. "It's a lot better than a shovel." "I bet it is. You're a company man now. Keep working hard, and you'll get rewarded. You've got to earn it, kid." Biff approached the counter curiously, his eyes peering down the hallway for just a split second, then back to the clutter surrounding Dobie. "Uncle Ewan said you're flying out with us for the 4th. "Yeah, I thought about fishing, but the lakes are so crazy on the 4th that I figured I would just make an appearance at the company picnic." "Uncle Ewan said it was a family reunion." I wonder if Paul ever went. Dobie flinched. "And I ain't family? Are you? Have you looked at yourself in the mirror lately? Where do you think you get all those freckles and ginger hair from? Your Uncle Ewan and I were all reared in the same playpen as babies. The lot of us. Sean, Morgan, Ewan, and I." There's so much I don't know about the Sinclair family tree. "How do you connect to the tree?" "The tree," Dobie chuckled. "You're a quick learner, aren't you? Branches and roots. You're going to fly out to Nova Scotia with us and get a headache trying to understand old Yggdrasil. For generations, the tree had had its princes and its workers. My family goes back as to the far branch older than this American branch you're part of. The Dobies make sure we get it done." "So have you ever flown in a plane?" "Nervous? Don't be. We're not going to be in one of the flying buses. We'll take the company plane. It's fast and safe." Dobie reached under his stocking cap to scratch his head. "Little lesson for you, Biff. Don't judge a book by its cover. You take one look at me and assume I sit at home drinking beer and eating potato chips. I've been all over this world on company and family business. I just know my place and do my job." Dobie continued to sort his papers. "Know your place, do your job." Biff held on to his other questions and went back outside to his waiting lunch. The rest of the afternoon left him with his thoughts on family legacy, on Norse mythology, and of thunderbirds and secret caves. Like clockwork, Wally Crane arrived with his fuel truck at the end of Biff's shift. Compared to Red and Uncle Ewan, Wally moved with the confidence of a movie star. His jet black hair was slicked back, and his mustache perfectly groomed. Biff climbed into the truck cab while Wally dealt with Dobie and the paperwork. Biff studied Wally from the front door to the cab door. His feet were light, His gait was casual, and his whistle was pleasant. Wally Crane was dull with a capital D. "Any plans for the 4th?" Wally asked once the fuel truck began rolling toward Biff's house. "I'm flying out with Uncle Ewan to a family reunion in Nova Scotia." "You don't say," Wally said, a crease forming on his forehead. "Your, Uncle Ewan's really taken you under his wing, huh?" Biff nodded and watched as the quarry passed by the window. "Hey," Wally said as they passed through St. John, "I've got a couple Boy Scout events coming up. Did you get the list in the mail?" "Yeah, but I'm pretty tired when I'm done working at the quarry. Maybe I can do the camping trip on Labor Day weekend." The conversation stalled as the truck headed east. When it descended the valley of the Blue Knife River, Wally asked, "Any news from your brother?" "Why is everyone always so focused on Paul?" Biff shook his head. "No, since he's been stationed in Vietnam, we haven't heard much from him. He's training the South Vietnamese to fight the commies, I guess." "Your brother was quite a leader in scouts. I can see how that translated into the military. I wish Paul were here now." As the fuel truck climbed the hill separating the reservation and Turtle Island State Park, thoughts of Paul filled Biff's head. Everyone talked about how awesome Paul had been, but with 10 years between the two of them, Biff remembered only indifference from his teenage brother when they were growing up. The only so-called bonding happened in moments where Paul would try to scare him. "Paul used to tell me stories about a monster that lived in Lake Manitou. He made it sound like Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, lived in the depths of the lake." "The Midgard serpent? Yeah, I don't know about that, but I do know that my dad used to tell me stories about a horned serpent that crawled out of the lake one night and tried to grab him. Luckily, he had a knife and cut his way free." Wally reached into the front pocket of his blue jeans and pulled out a short pocket knife. "Behold Mjolnir, Foehammer." Biff took the knife, opening its 2 blades. Wally Crane suddenly became more interesting than he'd been a few minutes earlier. Chapter 19. Oh Say Can You See? Old Copper Road, July 4th, 1961. Jimmy Nielsen looked outside to check the weather. Depending on the conditions, it meant fishing on the lake or along the river. The light pole hid the rest of the world in contrasted darkness, and the little plum trees in the front yard swayed. It was already a windy day. The only thing outside that didn't seem swayed by the wind was his father, Ed. His father stood at the corner of his pickup with a shotgun in hands. Leveled, but not aimed. His gaze fixed on a spot past the barn and toward the distant wheat field. I wonder what he sees. Jimmy slipped on yesterday's blue jeans, a fresh white t-shirt, and his Converse. In under a minute, he traveled from his bedroom to the screen door facing the front yard. He opened it slowly so the springs on the coil would not make a noise, and he held it as it closed behind him. His father still hadn't moved. I wonder if he spotted a skunk or a badger. Jimmy crept across the porch, down the front steps, and over the walkway that greeted the driveway. His father was now adjacent, looking off in the distance. "What is it?" Jimmy whispered. Wide eyes and both barrels of the shotgun spun to place Jimmy in the crosshairs. The air in his lungs suddenly felt as if he'd been gored by a bull, but his father's eyes had transformed into the eyes of a killer. Even when lashing out with a belt, his father's eyes never held so much anger and hatred. Then, with a simultaneous blink and gulp, his father's eyes returned. "What the blazes are you doing out here?" "I was going to help with chores, remember? And then head off for the day with Chris?" His father glanced back over his shoulder to the darkness before responding. "Oh, that's right." Jimmy's heart was still racing. "Did you see something?" "I'd gone down to the barn to feed the hogs, and I thought I saw some coyotes or wolves down by the shore." His father turned back to the darkness, still deepening by the bright, damp lamp illuminating the yard. Wolves? 4 of them, sniffing along the beach. I ran back to get the shotgun from the gun cabinet, and by that time, they were coming up the hill. I lost sight of them, though. How do you know they just weren't dogs? I don't. All I saw were dark forms in the distance. Could have been 4 bears, but only wolves hunt in packs. Jimmy scanned the distance. Already, the rising sun gave resolution to the entirety of Lake Manitou beyond their farmstead on the hill. Should I go get a rifle and we'll chase them off together? Hunting each fall was one of his favorite times spent with his father. No, my eyes aren't what they used to be. You're probably right. I probably saw 4 Canadian geese. His father shrugged. No, you've earned a day off to play with your friends. We'll get chores done, and then you can spend the day doing whatever you want. A few hours later, Jimmy rode his bicycle through the oak woods of Old Copper Road. Normally, the only concern was a lost traveler trying to find the entrance to Carousel Park. But today, he watched the shadows of the forest for signs of the 4 mysterious hunters. Once he passed the woods, he slowed when he saw the yellow police tape that effectively closed Carousel Park for the summer. His mother gave daily updates from the newspaper, including an explanation of how lawsuits would keep it from reopening. For the past several summers, he'd spent countless hours on rides and playing games. Now, like his childhood, that time was over. When he passed by the Forsberg farm, he slowed his pace. What's his problem? Since school ended, Biff had changed. He no longer wanted to play or even be adventurous. No fishing, no building stuff, no exploring. He turned into an adult the day he stole those Rice Krispie bars. Now he chose to accept an invitation to travel to some creep's house in Nova Scotia rather than hang out for a 4-day weekend. Biff's little sister Julia was standing on the second-floor porch and waved when she saw him. Now he'd have to deal with her for the whole day as the 2 families celebrated the 4th of July together. Jimmy was half Forsberg, yet Biff chose to celebrate with his Haggard blood. The betrayal caused him to bite his lower lip as he sped down the hill to the Doc Jenkins Bridge. Luckily, his friendship with Chris Looning remained intact. From Old Copper Road, he could see the rooftop of Chris's house, but to reach it, he needed to cross the bridge, ride down Market Street, and then cut back over the Fisher lumber mill. Chris lived in a monstrously large Victorian-era house. Even though Marlon Looning managed the lumber mill, the house was grander than his salary could afford. Marlon earned the house with a sex scandal that was still talked about decades later. They can keep their money for all the trouble it causes them, Jimmy decided as he dropped his bike in the front of the picket fence. Chris came stumbling out the front door with a tackle box, lunchbox, and fully rigged fishing pole. At least Chris has time for me. By mid-morning, the boys were set up along the eastern bank of the Crow Wing River, lines in the current. Fishing was terrible because every 10 minutes, vacationers in canoes passed through the clear water. Jimmy began to evaluate new options for fishing. Above his head, he could see the treetops getting blown by the strong northwestern wind, which meant the only calm place to fish along the lakeshore was several miles away at St. John. Yet Carousel Island would block the northwestern wind if they fished along the shore near Biff's house. Jimmy knew the perfect spot. He began reeling in his line, but Chris didn't so much as flinch. The sinker came bouncing up to shore, and still Chris, his eyes fixed on the trees, didn't notice. Jimmy picked up a stone and tossed it at his friend. Chris flinched. "Cut it out!" "What are you looking at? Seeing wolves?" "Wolves? No, are there wolves around here?" "I think they're farther up north in the old pine forest. Too many dogs and farmers around here." Chris began to reel up his line. "Do you want to go to another spot?" One smallmouth in an hour isn't going to cut it. There's a spot near Biff's place that should be sheltered from the wind and waves." The line reeled up all the way to the sinker, and the pole bent before Chris took notice. He pushed the button on his reel to release a little bit of line before he asked, "What's on the opposite shore?" Jimmy studied the old trees and shadows, afraid of what might be there. "Did you see something?" Chris shook his head. "No, I'm just trying to understand whose land that is on the western shore." "I'm pretty sure that's all McPherson land. You know that big hill where their farm is built, and how the ditch is so steep on the east side of the hill? I think we're looking at the bottom of the McPherson Hill." Chris hummed. "Why? And Lake Manitou is on the other side of the ridge, right?" "Yep. What are you thinking?" "Never mind, but, it's too bad there's not a bridge right here. Going back to the Doc Jenkins Bridge has to add a whole mile onto the trip, doesn't it? We should build our own bridge." "Yeah, either the DNR or floods would take it down." "How about a rope swing?" "Every idiot in a canoe would stop and use it. Then we'd have squatters on our property. Besides, how would we get our fishing gear across on a rope swing? I'm not wading across having wet underwear for the rest of the day. I've got to ride home still." "Okay, let's pack up and go then," Chris said, giving one last glance to the opposite shore. 20 minutes later, the boys descended the gravel road leading to the Doc Jenkins Bridge. The first thing Jimmy noticed was music. The doo-wop song with a female chorus sifted through the air in fragments, growing louder the closer they came to the bridge. Then Jimmy spotted a maroon Chevy, which he knew belonged to Gavin McPherson. Gavin had taken Jimmy's sister Alexandria to a dance last spring, but nothing came of it that he knew. The radio is probably just what scared away the fish. "Whoa," Chris muttered loud enough to be heard from the bridge. One of the unique features of the Doc Jenkins Bridge, besides the canopy of steel that formed the trestle, was its wooden plank flooring, which extended past the rails of the bridge to create a 3-foot wide platform along the side of the bridge. There, stretched out on a blanket, was a certifiable babe. In a scene from a California beach, the babe wore a yellow floral pink print bikini that would have rivaled Brigitte Bardot. Her skin was copper, and her bobbed hair was as black as the sunglasses she wore. One of her knees raised from the blanket, and she pulled herself up onto her elbows to speak to the river below. "Company." Afraid his jeans might not be able to hide his thoughts, Jimmy felt like turning around. The babe, now sitting up with her flat stomach, had cleavage that, by Jimmy's standards of measurement, was somewhere between grapefruit and cantaloupe. "Well, hello, Christopher," the babe said with a slight smile on her crimson lips. Her voice felt like Superman's super chilled breath. It sent shockwaves through Jimmy's heart. "Hello, Nicole," Chris answered sheepishly, yet he had big enough balls to steer his bike toward her side of the bridge. "You've grown up," Nicole noted. Jimmy, using his buddy as a shield, stopped behind Chris. "I'm a teenager now. I'm going to be going to Split Rock this fall. I'll probably see you in the halls." Of course, it was Nicole Guerin. The reclusive Indian family that sent their kids to Turtle Island Jesuit School had produced a babe almost unworthy of public school. Chris turned to explain to Jimmy. "Nicole used to be my babysitter when I was an ankle biter." I had my older sisters. Damn. A moment later, Gavin McPherson came up from the southwestern corner of the bridge, wearing swimming trunks. The lucky bastard looked like a Ken doll to Nicole's brunette Barbie. From his perfectly cool wet hair to his muscular chest and rippled abdomen and defined arms, he made Jimmy want to jump off the bridge like old Doc Jenkins had once done. They deserved each other. "Fish biting?" Gavin asked, slowing his pace like a golden lion, ready to protect his lioness from a couple scabby hyenas. "I caught a smallmouth," Chris answered, leaving Jimmy speechless. All he could do was step onto his pedal and continue on his way. Behind him, Chris said, "Well, it was nice seeing you again, Nicole. I'm glad you'll be a bulldog." Chubby Checker's twist playfully mocked their retreat. Just 5 years older, junior Gavin McPherson doubled Jimmy's muscle mass, and if Jimmy were ever going to earn a babe like Nicole Guerin, he needed to pack on some muscles like Biff was doing. Perhaps there were some advantages to growing up. A Wind Age, a Wolf Age. Chapter 20. Oak Island, Nova Scotia, July 4th, 1961. Biff Forsberg invented a mental machete. Not a real blade, of course, which would chop off each hand that held him by the shoulder or tousled his hair. At first, there had been so much manhandling that he worried about the real possibilities of a sex cult. For this reason, he kept an aluminum pen in his side pocket in case he needed to slam it into some pervert's neck. Alas, it truly was just a family reunion. He sat, now on the final day of his trip, along the shore overlooking Mahone Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. Although the older relatives freely intermingled, their children formed into little gangs of common interest. Biff sat with the Albany kids, with the Portuguese kids to the left and the French kids to the right. All totaled, there were about 40 kids watching the fireworks reflect off the waters of the bay. Sinclair Mansion was built on one of the 24 islands in Mahone Bay, with a concrete bridge connecting to the road that led back to the city of Halifax. The stone bridge looked like a large hotel, 3 stories tall with 50 windows on each side of the long rectangle. It had been built in the late 1800s by William Sinclair, brother of St. John's founding father, Scott Sinclair. While Scott produced a son and 5 fertile daughters, William produced only a solitary daughter who vanished in the mountains of Colorado, something still whispered about decades later. After William's death, the house became a vacation home for the families that owned Triton Corporation. During his 4-day vacation, Biff learned the place's history and met 2 billionaires. Even though he couldn't remember Mr. Tarrant's first name, they talked openly for a good 5 minutes about the threat of communism to South Vietnam. The Tarrants owned rubber tree plantations, which were used to create tires. Mr. Tarrant had assurances from President Kennedy that the communists would not steal his prized trees from him. That is when Uncle Ewan stepped in to explain how Paul had joined the U.S. Army, leaving Biff to serve interests at home. The second billionaire was Ross Delhut, who got super drunk on Saturday night and was knocking stuff over to the consternation of the old women. Ross made Biff smile. A recent college graduate, Ross was far more interested in Biff's football acumen than talking about his steel empire in Detroit. For the next 3 days, Ross gave Biff 6-shooter gestures whenever they passed. Along with meeting billionaires, Biff met several doppelgangers. Never in his life did he blend in with a crowd, but at the Sinclair Mansion, half of the kids had freckles and red hair, including Dobie's nephew, Thomas Dobie, from Albany. Ross Delhut had dubbed them the Lollipop Guild, which brought laughter from the adults and fear from the other kids, who knew bullies. Away from the adults, none of the kids laughed at the brooding cousins. Tom sat next to Biff and spent more time pulling tufts of grass from the yard than watching the colorful explosions overhead. When a barrage of cannon fire signaled the grand finale for the light show, all 300 visitors clapped for whoever had set it up. A hand grabbed Biff by the shoulder. Uncle Ewan. Mr. Sinclair is going to tell stories by the bonfire. You've been invited to join him. Tom looked at Biff and shrugged. They'll have you playing bagpipes soon. While the crowd flowed back to the illuminated back porch where music and desserts waited, Uncle Ewan walked Biff to a secluded area, past the helicopter pad, and through a manicured path lined with the trees. Biff assumed it to be the center of the island, for when they reached it, not a glimmer of water could be seen, only stars above their head. 4 or 5 elementary-age kids already sat at a table-sized bonfire. In a larger chair, an old white man sat with vibrant white hair and chin capable of making turkeys jealous. Sitting in a smaller chair beside him was a woman, her head wrapped in a shawl that seemed to envelop her entire body. And completely out of place was Dobie, sitting beside the billionaire Alistair Sinclair. "Don't embarrass me," Uncle Ewan whispered in Biff's ear before leaving. Biff sat down with the younger kids and waited until the last few were escorted to the private bonfire. He remained the oldest by 3 or 4 years. "Did you enjoy the fireworks?" Alistair asked to resounding acclaim. "Good, good. I would like you to meet my very good friend. This is Sarah Olavintiar. She is a storyteller. She is a knower, which makes her far more qualified to tell the stories from the dawn than me. But when I was your age, this is how I began to learn the legends of our family." "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair." Her voice was melodic, even when saying something simple. Her eyes studied them for a moment, and Biff looked down. "You see an old man in front of you, whose twilight is coming. He was once young like you, and one day, if you are lucky, you'll live to a ripe old age also. Life and death is a cycle. Do any of you know the story of the Twilight of the Gods?" "Yes." Before Biff could raise a hand or verbalize the answer, a young girl shouted, "It's the Ragnarok." "Good, good. Now tell me, what do you think you know?" "It begins with a triple winter," a boy blurted. For the next several minutes, Biff kept his mouth shut as the kids told the stories about Loki's escape and betrayal, Odin getting eaten by the great wolf Fenrir, silent Vidar avenging Odin's death, Thor killing and then tragically dying in the battle with the Midgard serpent, and how Heimdall and Loki died in each other's hands. The shawled woman smiled, nodded, and corrected each account. How do these kids know these stories so well? Even though she was almost entirely covered by her shawl, her face and hands were stunning, beautiful. Biff found himself focused entirely on the playful nature of her lips. What was the signal that the Ragnarok would begin? "The Midgard serpent would rise. Heimdall blows the Jarlhorn. The ships of the dead break free. Loki escapes." Miss Olenvietiar navigated the answers before giving her own. "It is Fimbulvetter, the terrible winter. Before any of it can happen, the worst winter in history of the world is triggered. Only then will the great tree Yggdrasil shudder and moan. When the tree is destroyed, the doom is sealed." Biff hated school, even those around bonfires. Then she did something he hated most. She called on him. Her gaze settled on him, forcing him to look up for her question. Did all life perish in the great battle Ragnarok? Biff cleared his throat and offered, "No, there were survivors. 2 humans survived by hiding in a tree." "Go on, child." "The fire giant Surtur ends the battle when he destroys the world in flame, but in destroying it, he's buried in the rubble. And even though Asgard is destroyed, there are 4 survivors: Vidar and Vali, the sons of Odin, and Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor." "Surtur's bane," Alistair Sinclair mumbled under his breath. "And what is their purpose, Mr. Sinclair?" Biff studied Mr. Sinclair, wondering the answer. "They will avenge the destruction of the world by Surtur and bring a new spring to the world. They will help restore things to the former glory of the old world. But where are the heirs of Asgard? Miss Olavetjar asked rhetorically. Some say they are buried, just like evil Surtur is buried and dormant. Others say they are disguised and living in the world of men. Other tales say they passed their strength on to their heirs. Can any of you tell me how the stories described Thor? She fielded a variety of answers until she heard the one she wanted. Yes, he is known for his red hair. It is the feature unique to the northern lands, isn't it? The red hair of our forefathers is a link back to the days of the dawn, our connection. Be proud of who you are, children. Dobie, still not having said a word, crossed his arms and nodded. Miss Olenviatar continued, asking, Was the Ragnarok a loss? A failure by Odin? No, Biff blurted out. Explain. Hope remained after his death. The battle is not over. What is your name, child? Brian. Our brother Brian has the heart of the answer. In the dawn of the gods, Odin learned a terrible truth. The world was in a terrible cycle of destruction. Ice and fire, again and again, destroyed the world before it could blossom. The doom of mankind, the giants, and even the gods was complete, a twisted play that continued generation after generation. Odin was determined to break the cycle. Do any of you know how he learned this secret knowledge? He gave up his eye at the Well of Mimir, someone answered. In a way, yes. At the Well of Mimir, he learned the future, the fate of all living things. Yet upon learning his destiny, and the destiny of all, he did something to change it all. He killed himself, Biff answered so bluntly that some of the children gasped. Even Dobie snapped his head to stare at Biff. A smile crept onto Miss Olenviatjar's face. Biff continued, It was a sacrifice. Odin hung himself from the great tree Yggdrasil, and there his spirit journeyed into the dark waters. He returned from this journey with a plan to destroy the destiny given to the world. He found a path that would claim his life, but ultimately give his life a chance to survive its destined doom. He did it so the next generation would survive. And that is why you are all here at my bonfire, Alistair Sinclair said. One day I will die like Odin, and you will be asked to lead in the fight against death. You will be champions of life, fighting for the free will of all. Your parents bring you here because we all share in this fight. When Odin temporarily died at the tree, not only did he see the future, but he also saw the past. He saw the mysteries of the universe written upon the foundations of our world. When he came back to life, he knew an ancient language, which we now call runes. He taught this language to his people, but many of us have forgotten how to read it. My friend Sarah has been learning this old language. Did you know that it was once a song? Alistair paused to let them ponder before asking, Would you like Sarah to sing some of it to you? Biff felt a chill run down his spine. This is bad. Very bad. I can sing some of it in English, since I doubt any of you will understand the old tongue. I'll sing the opening verses describing the beginning of the Ragnarok, so that, like Odin, you might guard your hearts and prepare yourselves in the coming battle. And she began. It sates itself on the lifeblood of fated men, paints red the powers' homes with crimson gore. Black become the sun's beams in the summers that follow, weathers all treacherous. Do you still seek to know? And what? Brothers will fight and kill each other. Sisters' children will defile kinship. It is harsh in the world, whoredom rife, an axe age, a sword age, shields are riven, a wind age, a wolf age. Before the world goes headlong, no man will have mercy on another. As she sang, Biff closed his eyes and pictured himself, an old man fighting in a great battle, his friends around him. He was wounded, crawling with his last heartbeats to destroy the enemy standing over him. Chapter 21. The Turtle Shell. Invermere, British Columbia, August 4th, 1961. Leonard White Elk tried not to think of his dreams, especially while at work. He focused on the 5 sizzling hamburger patties in front of him, waiting for the right moment to flip each. His red bandana caught the sweat from his brow, and his long hair was braided down the middle of his back. After a week at work at the grill, he'd need to soak in the hot springs for an entire day to purge his body from all the grease. My last burgers of the summer. He flipped the patties onto buns and rang the bell in front of him. Although his skin was pocked from the grease and that plugged his pores, the rest of his body was in pristine model of health. His weightlifting regimen each morning left his arms and chest looking like those of a football player. Compared to the rest of the kitchen staff at Copper Valley Golf Course, he was taller by a foot. His Lakota blood, his brothers told him. He wiped his hands on a clean towel and stepped away from the grill, peeking through the small window that looked out to the restaurant. Most of the golfers were off the course, and those still sitting at the restaurant had been fed. Leonard returned to the grill and began scraping. It was time to go home. His summer home was a quarter-mile from the clubhouse. As he walked to the Shuswap Indian Reservation, he looked up at the stars. He lived in an aluminum trailer parked in the open lot used by the local Shuswap people. Without electricity or plumbing, it was a glorified tent. Leonard lived alone. He quickly changed out of his white pants and shirt and slipped on a pair of blue jeans and a black t-shirt. He stuffed his dirty laundry into a basket, grabbed his keys, and hopped in his big truck. His permanent home was a 20-minute drive down BC 93, which came through the mountains from the east at a place named Sinclair Pass, and then turned south, paralleling Windermere Lake. Leonard lived in the Canadian Rockies at the Great Continental Divide. A crease ran down the spine of the Canadian Rockies from north to south, which turned the narrow valley into a summer vacation destiny for Calgary ranchers, adventurous travelers, or the wealthy elite. The last 5 burgers he'd served earlier had been eaten by businessmen from Miami, Florida. Fairmont Hot Springs, another resort town, provided golf in the summer and alpine skiing during the winter. His 4 brothers worked at the various resorts in various capacities, and like himself, they all lived in cabins on the remote slopes of Indian Head Mountain that overlooked the resorts below. Before he could go home, he had to make a stop. A block off the highway, Leonard had purchased a small 2-bedroom bungalow. Wanda Laurier, a widow at 40, took one of the rooms free of charge on the condition she cared for his invalid mother. Leonard spent 3 months working at the resort to pay for the 9 months he wouldn't have to work. He knocked lightly on the front door before slipping in his key. Wanda had left a light on in the kitchen, casting the living room with enough light to see. A moment later, she appeared in a robe. "I have all of her stuff sitting there beside the door," Wanda said, her arms crossed. "I'm still getting paid for the rest of August, aren't I?" "Of course, but I might need you for a few weeks after my vision quest. Once I know the path I need to walk, I might need to bring her back down the mountain if I have to leave. You? Leave? Where in the world would you go? I might need to travel to Minnesota for a few weeks to deal with some family matters. Oh, that's right. Fawn is originally from Minnesota, isn't she? He ignored the question and asked, Is she ready? She's ready, if that's what you mean. I'm not sure how much of this plan she even understands. Can you help put her stuff in the truck? You're leaving tonight? Stay, sleep on the couch. Ma's going to sleep regardless of the time of day. I'd rather get going and wake up in my own bed. With a huff, Wanda came for the bags at the door, and Leonard walked back to his mother's room. Anin ni mama, Leonard whispered. Hello, Mother. He only knew Fawn Treville from the stories told by his family. On Leonard's birthbed, Fawn had a brain aneurysm that left the mother of 5 boys with permanent brain damage and the inability to walk. Surprisingly, she survived, first nursed by her Lakota husband White Elk, and then later by Leonard, who felt guilt and responsibility for her. Fawn felt no heavier than a sack of rice in his arms as he scooped her up from her bed. His kiss on her brow woke her from her slumber. The stroke had paralyzed the left side of her face, leaving her right eye, cheek, and corner of her mouth to express her emotions. Fawn smiled as a little tear came down her cheek. Although Wanda insisted on a short haircut for Fawn, she made sure to keep her hair brushed and her nails polished. When Leonard reached the back of the truck, he effortlessly laid Fawn on a bed of comforters and covered her with another. He told her, You can see the stars on our way home. With his mother situated, he turned back to the house. Thank you, Wanda. If I don't come back, you can keep the house. What is that supposed to mean? Wanda asked. I shouldn't be going anywhere near Lake Manitou. Leonard closed the door without answering. As he drove from the foothills of Fairmont Hot Springs and up the mountain road that led to Akisnook First Nations Reservation, he caught glimpses of the stars through the trees. He was fluent in 4 cultures. His mother had been Anishinaabe, his father had been Lakota, and his friends had been local Shuswap and Akisnook. All 4 had stories about the constellation known as the Big Dipper. All 4 had tales involving Orion also, but Fawn's version included a variation on the constellation known as the Wintermaker. Leonard reached his cabin a little after midnight. He immediately tended to his mother's needs, setting her up in her wooden rocking chair to face the morning sun. After bringing in her belongings and medicine, he flopped onto his bed for some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. He woke to an ogre looming over his bed. Are you really going through with this plan of yours? Russell White Elk had 2 inches and 100 pounds on his brother, but little of it was muscle. The casino bouncer was all bark but little bite. Leonard groaned and rolled out of bed. When did you get here? Dennis got all of us up on the radio this morning. He said he saw you get back sometime after midnight. He got another letter from McGeesee. Did he? We're all going to wait to talk some sense into you. If Ma agrees, there's no changing my mind, Leonard said and got up. He still wore his blue jeans and black shirt, even though he left his boots where he'd kicked them off upon entering the cabin. Outside, all 3 Labiche brothers waited by their various steeds. Dennis, the eldest at 49, had an open-top Jeep. Clyde had saddled his horse, and Vernon, the youngest Labiche brother at 46, had a yellow, rusty truck. The grandsons of Blackfish Labiche all had sullen eyes, but the fat cheeks of their mother Fawn. Their father, John Labiche, had died at the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Reservation in North Dakota when all 3 boys were young. Instead of going home, Fawn and her father-in-law, Blackfish, took them to the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in South Dakota, where she met her second husband, White Elk. For 5 years, the family lived in South Dakota before they continued Fawn's quest to the top of the turtle shell that she'd once seen in a dream. 4 years after settling on Indian Head Mountain, Fawn had her aneurysm, giving birth to Leonard. "Tell me about the new letter," Leonard said. "McGeesee asked for us to send 2 of our boys to him so they can be properly trained. Wawasheshi and Benace," Leonard explained. "He wants representatives of the Deer Clan and the Bird Clan to learn the rituals." Russell huffed. "We know what McGeesee wants, but we're not sending any of our children to Lake Manitou while Lily Guerin lives." "She survived the fire?" "She's still recovering in the hospital, but she's getting stronger by the day. It was all a false alarm. We were right to ignore it." Leonard's dream came flooding back, hardening his resolve. "None of us know. If McGeesee is right, and the servants of the Wintermaker are attempting to wake the sleeping evil while the Asante Lodge is at its weakest, then we not only fail him, but also our ancestors. While you've chosen not to have a family or children, the rest of us have something to protect. Ma has 23 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren living in these hills. She brought us here for our protection. You know this to be true. You know what is special about this place." "We can't hide from a fight, because if we lose, there will be no place on earth to hide. You all know this to be true," Leonard sighed. "What else am I supposed to do?" "Ma's a feeble woman. You know what this trip would do to her." "I do. She's held on for 36 miserable years. And if we could talk with her one more time for one more day, wouldn't you trade those 36 years trapped in a broken body?" "There's no guarantee this will even work." "If it doesn't work, I'll return to Lake Manitou. I'll learn whatever McGeesee wants to teach me, and I'll look after the others." "I can't let you do this to our mother." "Then let her decide." "Does she even know what's going on?" "Let's find out," Leonard said, returning to the cabin. Fawn was looking outside, and he kissed her head on the top of her head before pulling the rocking chair backwards and onto the porch. "Ma, tell the others where you want me to take you." Fawn's head began to bobble. Her right hand twitched, and her throat cleared. A rivulet of drool came down her chin, which Leonard gently wiped away. "Cave." Leonard looked up and pointed to the higher peak of Indian Head Mountain. "And why are we going there?" Again, Fawn took a moment, as if winding up her strength, to mutter a single slurred word. "Quest." Leonard nodded. Mother and son had rarely communicated effectively through verbal communication, but their kindred spirits united them in purpose. "And of all your grandchildren, which one should come with us up the mountain?" Fawn's eyes looked to Vernon. "Ben." Vernon muttered under his breath and shook his head. "The folks at Lake Manitou did not ask for this to happen to them, nor do any of us want it to happen. But we must act, and if a vision quest will guide our path, then why do we delay?" Clyde burst in a sudden sob, pinching the bridge of his nose to hide his emotions. "McGeesee sent a package with the letter. He reminded us that he and Fawn were always allies, and that he misses her wise counsel. He said this will help guide us." Dennis handed the open package to Leonard and walked to put a hand on Clyde's shoulder. Vernon stood his ground. "I'm glad it's Ben. I'll go fetch the boy, and then he's all yours. I swear, Leonard, you're not taking him to Lake Manitou while that witch is alive. Understood? You can bring him up to that mountain cave, but that's it. Leonard nodded. Russell White Elk lingered as the others departed. Do you want help bringing Ma up the slope? I know you're strong as an ox, but that's one hell of a trip. I'll have time to catch my breath once I reach the cave. I'll have the boy to give me a hand, too. Russell lowered his head and walked away. Leonard opened the 4 leaves of the box. Inside he found a freshly cut willow fronds, feathers, beads, and animal sinew. Materials for a dream catcher. For a final conversation with Ma. This is the end of part 5.